When something goes wrong, the first thing we all want to know is who's to blame? Well, the law has a surprisingly complex and honestly a fascinating way of answering that exact question. Turns out, it's not always about who did the wrongful act, but about who the law says is ultimately responsible. So, ready to get into it?
So picture this. An employee makes a massive mistake, a really huge error that costs the company millions. Who pays? The employee who messed up? The company that hired them? Or, and this is a real possibility, could it be that in the eyes of the law, nobody is actually liable? We're going to solve this whole puzzle by looking at the law's two most powerful tools for playing the blame game, the shield and the magnet.
All right, so first up, let's talk about how someone can completely avoid blame. The law actually gives defendants this, you can think of it like a powerful shield. It's a set of arguments that, if you can prove them, can totally excuse a wrongful act. And these are called general defenses. And this is the crucial part. A general defense isn't just some minor excuse. No, it's a full-on legal justification that basically says, yeah, the thing happened, but it wasn't legally wrongful because of these specific circumstances. And what makes them general is that this shield can be used against almost any kind of civil wrong, or what lawyers love to call a tort.
Okay, so this is pretty interesting. Looking at the legal source material, we can see which of these shields are the real heavy hitters. Consent and act of God are tied for the lead, with statutory authority also being a big one. For our purposes, we're really going to zero in on the one you'll probably encounter most, consent.
So let's talk about consent. Is it really the ultimate get-out-of-jail-free card in civil law? I mean, if you agree to take a risk, can you really not complain when things actually go wrong? Let's find out.
Lawyers, they just love their Latin, and the key phrase here is volenti non fit injuria. It sounds super complicated, right? But the translation is actually beautiful and simple. To a willing person, injury is not done. Just think about stepping into a boxing ring. You are totally agreeing to the risk of getting punched. That simple idea is the bedrock of this entire defense. And this quote right here, it just nails it. The law makes a big distinction between harm, the actual damage, and a legal injury. If you willingly accept the risk of that harm, the law says you haven't suffered a legal injury that you can sue over. So in that boxing match, you might suffer the harm of a black eye, for sure, but you haven't suffered a legal injury because you consented to the fight. See the difference? But, and this is a huge but, this defense only works if two really strict conditions are met. First, the person has to have full knowledge. You can't consent to a risk you don't actually understand. And second, that consent has to be totally 100% free and voluntary. If someone was forced or tricked or pressured into it, their consent is worthless in court. And yeah, this shield, it's not invincible. It has its limits. For example, you can't consent to something that's just plain illegal, like a duel to the death. And get this, it usually doesn't apply in what are called rescue cases. If someone negligently starts a fire and you get hurt trying to save someone from the building, the person who started the fire can't just say, well, you consented to the risk of being a hero. The law actually wants to encourage people to be heroes, not punish them for it. Okay, so a shield can deflect blame. That makes sense. But what happens when there's just no excuse? When the act was clearly wrongful and someone is definitely on the hook for it? This brings us to the second and maybe more surprising tool the law uses. What if the person who actually committed the act isn't the one who has to answer for it? What if the blame itself can be moved? And this is where we bring in our second big idea, the blame magnet. It's this incredible legal principle that literally pulls responsibility away from the person who directly caused the harm and sticks it onto someone else entirely. The proper legal term for this is vicarious liability. Now, vicarious liability is a form of what's called strict liability. And all that really means is it applies even if the person being blamed wasn't personally at fault at all. The classic example, and what we're focused on here, is an employer being held legally responsible for something their employee did wrong. And again, the justification comes from this old Latin maxim, respondeat superior. Literally, let the superior answer. It's this public policy idea that the person or the company in the position of power, the employer, should be the one to carry the weight of responsibility. So why on earth would the law do this? Well, it really boils down to a few key things. First, it's practical. Employers usually have deeper pockets and insurance, which means victims can actually get paid for their injuries. Second, it's kind of about fairness. Since a business profits from its employees' work, it should also have to shoulder the risks. And finally, there's this legal fiction that the employee is basically an extension of the employer. Now, obviously, a boss isn't on the hook for everything an employee does, right? Like 24/7. The absolute key factor, the thing everything hinges on, is whether the wrongful act happened in the course of employment. So how in the world do courts decide if someone was on the clock? Well, courts generally look at this in two ways. The first one is super simple. The employer straight up told the employee to do the thing. But the second one, that's where all the action is. This is when an employee was doing their authorized job, but they did it in an unauthorized or even forbidden way. Think about a delivery driver who was told not to speed, but does it anyway and causes an accident. That is a perfect example. To deal with all those messy gray areas, modern courts use something called the close connection test. They ask, was the employee's wrongful act so closely connected to the work they were hired to do that it's just fair to make the employer liable? This test is so powerful it can even apply to intentional or criminal acts, like a bouncer at a club using excessive force. And one last, super important distinction here, this blame magnet, it generally only works for employees, or what the law sometimes calls servants. It doesn't usually apply to independent contractors. And the key difference? It all comes down to one word: control. An employer controls both what an employee does and how they do it. With a contractor, you just hire them for a result. You don't get to control the how. All right, so we've looked at both sides of this, the shield and the magnet. After all that, what's the final takeaway on how the law decides who's responsible when things go sideways? It really just boils down to this. The law has a shield, those general defenses, like consent, that can deflect blame completely, basically saying no legal wrong ever happened. And it has a magnet, the rule of vicarious liability, that can pull the blame from one person and stick it to another, making sure the one who benefits from a business also has to bear its risks. So understanding these two tools gives us a really clear framework for how legal blame works. But it also leaves us with this bigger, maybe more philosophical question to chew on. Just because the law says someone is responsible, does that always line up with our own gut feeling about who is morally right or wrong? Something to think about.